In the late 1930s, before the world broke apart, Coventry was an ordinary English city filled with ordinary lives. Streets lined with brick houses, the hum of factories, bicycles leaning against iron fences, the smell of coal fires in the morning air. It was the kind of place where nothing remarkable seemed to happen until everything did. Among the thousands who called Coventry home were two young people whose lives followed a quiet, familiar rhythm. Henry Weber was 21, the son of a machinist working long hours in a factory that helped keep Britain moving. His hands were rough from metal and oil, but there was a steadiness to him, the kind of man who didn't speak more than he needed to, but meant every word he said. Pauline was different. She had a warmth that filled a room before she even spoke. She worked in a local shop, knew most of the neighborhood by name, and had a way of remembering small details, birthdays, favorite sweets, little things that made people feel seen. Where Henry was reserved, Pauline was open. Where he was quiet, she was alive with energy. And somehow it worked. No one could point to the exact moment their story began. Maybe it was a passing glance at a bus stop. Maybe it was a shared laugh at something small and forgettable. But by the summer of 1938, they were inseparable. Evenings meant long walks through the city streets, past shop windows and dim streetlights, talking about everything and nothing. They spoke of small dreams, a home of their own, maybe a garden, perhaps children someday. Nothing grand, just a life. And at the time, that was enough. But the world beyond Coventry was changing. News traveled slowly, carried through newspapers and radios, spoken in cautious tones over dinner tables. Germany, expansion, tension building across Europe. Words like war began to appear more often, though they still felt distant, something happening somewhere else to someone else. Henry followed the news, quietly. He didn't say much about it, but Pauline noticed the way he lingered a little longer by the radio, the way his brow tightened when headlines were read aloud. She would ask what he was thinking, and he would shrug it off. "It won't come to that," he'd say. "Not again." People wanted to believe that. Coventry carried on as it always had. Workers went to factories, shops opened in the morning and closed at dusk, children played in the streets. But beneath the routine, something was shifting. Air raid precautions began to appear. Blackout curtains were discussed. Gas masks were issued, though many treated them like an inconvenience rather than a warning. Still, life continued. Henry and Pauline held on to it. In August 1939, the air felt different. Even those who avoided the news could sense it now. Conversations changed. There was a weight to them, a hesitation, as if everyone understood something was coming, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Then, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. There was no dramatic moment in Coventry, no sudden explosion, no immediate chaos, just a quiet, heavy realization settling over the city. Shops still opened, buses still ran, but everything felt altered, as though the future had shifted overnight into something uncertain and fragile. Henry didn't enlist immediately. Like many, he waited, watched, listened. There was still a belief, however faint, that it might not last long, that somehow it could be contained. But as months passed, that hope faded. By early 1940, the war was no longer distant. Reports of fighting grew more intense. Casualty lists began to appear. Names, real names, printed in ink. Men not so different from Henry. The pressure to join grew, not just from the government, but from within, a sense of duty, of inevitability. Henry didn't talk about it much at first, but Pauline could see it. The way he became quieter, the way his thoughts seemed elsewhere even when he sat beside her. One evening, as they walked the same familiar streets they had walked so many times before, he finally said it. "I think I have to go." It wasn't a question. Pauline stopped walking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city continued around them, Distant voices, a passing car, the faint echo of footsteps on pavement. Ordinary life, still moving, even as theirs began to change. She knew this moment would come. Everyone did. But knowing it and hearing it were not the same. "When?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Soon," he said. "I can't just stay here, not while all of that is happening." He didn't need to explain. She understood. There was no argument, no dramatic protest. That wasn't who they were. Instead, there was something harder: acceptance. In the days that followed, everything became more precious. Time moved differently. Every conversation felt heavier, as if both of them were trying to say things they didn't quite know how to put into words. They talked about practical things: where she would live, how often he might be able to write, what she should do if things didn't go as planned. But beneath it all was something unspoken: the fear that this might be the last time things felt normal. On the morning he left, Coventry looked the same as it always had: the same streets, the same buildings, the same sky. But for Henry and Pauline, it was no longer the same place. They stood together at the station, surrounded by others in similar moments: quiet goodbyes, forced smiles, hands held just a little tighter than usual. No one wanted to break first. Henry carried a small bag, nothing more than he needed. Pauline noticed how ordinary it looked, how something so small could carry him so far away. "All right," he said. "I know," she replied. It was a simple promise, but it would become everything. When the train arrived, there was no more time, no perfect words, no way to prepare for what came next. He stepped forward, then paused, turning back to her one last time. For a brief moment, it was just the two of them again: not a soldier, not a war, just Henry and Pauline, standing in the life they had built together. Then he was gone. The train pulled away, carrying him out of Coventry, out of the life they knew, and into something neither of them could fully understand yet. Pauline stood there long after it had disappeared, holding on to the last image of him, as if letting it fade would make everything that much more real. She didn't know then how many letters would come. She didn't know how far they would travel, or how much they would carry. All she knew was that the life they had lived, the quiet walks, the small dreams, the ordinary days, now belonged to the past, and ahead of them lay a story that would be written not in moments they shared, but in words sent across distance, time, and war.
The first letter arrived sooner than Pauline expected. It came folded in a thin envelope, his handwriting instantly familiar, as if a part of him had found its way back home. She didn't open it right away. For a moment she just held it, tracing the ink of his name, steadying herself. This was the beginning of something new: not presence, but words; not him, but the closest thing she would have. When she finally unfolded the paper, his voice returned. He wrote about the journey first: the crowded train, the nervous laughter among men who were trying not to show it, the awkward silence that followed when no one quite knew what to say next. He described the barracks, cold, louder than he expected, filled with strangers who were quickly becoming something else. Not quite friends yet, but no longer strangers either. He told her not to worry. That line would appear often. Training was harder than anything he had known before: long days that began before sunrise, drills that seemed endless, boots that never quite felt comfortable, and officers who demanded more than anyone thought they had to give. But Henry didn't complain, not really. Even in those early letters there was a kind of quiet determination in his words, as if he had already accepted that this was his path. Still, between the lines, Pauline could see what he didn't say: the uncertainty, the adjustment, the absence of everything familiar. He asked about home more than he wrote about himself, about the streets, the shop, the neighbors, small things, ordinary things. He wanted to know if the world he had left behind was still intact, still waiting for him in the same shape. Pauline wrote back immediately. Her letters were longer, fuller. She described everything: the weather, the customers who came into the shop, the small changes in the city, even the things that seemed too insignificant to matter. She filled the pages with life, as if by doing so she could send a piece of Coventry back to him. And slowly a rhythm formed. Letter sent, letter received. Days measured not by time, but by distance between words. Weeks passed, and Henry's letters began to change. At first, they were careful, almost restrained, but as the routine of training settled in, he began to open up more. He wrote about the men he trained with: a farmer from Yorkshire who had never been outside his village, a clerk from London who talked too much when he was nervous, a boy barely 18 who lied about his age to join. They were all different, but they shared the same reality now. There was humor, too. Small moments that broke through the tension, missteps during drills, jokes passed quietly between ranks, the absurdity of certain rules that no one dared question out loud. Henry had a way of describing these things simply, without exaggeration, but Pauline could almost hear the laughter behind the words. For a while, it was enough to hold on to, but even in those lighter moments, the war was never far away. There were days when letters didn't come. Those were the hardest. Pauline would wait, telling herself it was nothing: delays, lost post, the normal interruptions of military life. But the silence carried weight. Each day without a letter stretched longer than it should have, filled with questions she couldn't answer. And then, just as the worry began to settle too deeply, another envelope would arrive, and with it, relief. Henry never mentioned fear directly, not in those early months, but sometimes in the way he wrote, the pauses, the sentences left unfinished, the sudden shift from detail to distance, it was there, unspoken but present. He wrote about night more than day, about lying awake in unfamiliar surroundings, listening to the quiet sounds of the barracks, thinking about everything he had left behind, about Coventry, about her. "I keep thinking about the same streets," he wrote once. "It's strange what you miss, not the big things, just the ordinary ones." Pauline read that line more than once, because she understood. Life at home had changed too, even if she tried to make it sound the same in her letters. There were more uniforms in the streets, more uncertainty. Rationing had begun to shape daily routines, and though Coventry still stood untouched, there was an awareness, growing, impossible to ignore, that it might not stay that way. But she didn't write about that, not fully. Just as Henry shielded her from the harshness of training, she shielded him from the weight of home. Their letters became a space where the world was softened, where fear was filtered into something manageable, where they could still be who they were before everything changed. Time moved forward. Training intensified. The tone of Henry's letters shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for Pauline to notice. There was more focus now, less uncertainty, as if he was no longer adjusting, but preparing. For what, neither of them said outright. Then one letter arrived, different from the others, shorter, more direct. He told her he might be moving soon, that he didn't know exactly where or when, just that things were changing. He said, "I'll write when I can. It might not be as often." Pauline felt the meaning behind those words before she fully understood them. This wasn't just training anymore. The distance between them was about to grow, not just in miles, but in everything that came with it. She wrote back that same night, longer than usual, filling every space on the page. She didn't want there to be anything left unsaid, even though she still couldn't bring herself to say the one thing that mattered most. Instead, she wrote about waiting, about home, about how she would be there, no matter how long it took. When his next letter came, it carried a different weight. There was less detail, more gaps, not because he didn't want to write, but because there were things he couldn't explain anymore, places he couldn't name, movements he couldn't describe. But even then he wrote about the sky, about the ground beneath his boots, about the way time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once, and always about her. The letters had become something more than communication. They were a lifeline, a way to hold on to something real in a world that was becoming increasingly uncertain.
Neither of them knew how long this phase would last. Neither of them knew where the next letter would come from. But one thing had already been set in motion. What began as words between two people separated by distance was slowly becoming something else, a record of time, of change, of a life unfolding far from home. And soon those words would have to travel much farther than either of them had imagined.
By the time Henry's letters began arriving from North Africa, something in them had changed in a way Pauline could feel immediately, even before she understood why. The paper was different, thinner, worn from travel. The ink sometimes faded as if the heat itself had pressed against the words, and the tone, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. He didn't describe the journey in detail, just fragments, endless movement, the sea stretching out in every direction, the sense of leaving behind not just England, but everything familiar. When he finally wrote the words North Africa, it felt distant and unreal, like something out of a newspaper rather than his life. But it was his life now. The desert was the first thing he tried to explain. Not just the heat, though he mentioned that often, how it settled into everything, how it made even simple tasks exhausting. It was the emptiness that struck him most. Miles of land that seemed untouched, silent in a way that felt unnatural. No streets, no buildings, nothing to anchor the eye, just sand and sky stretching endlessly. "It doesn't feel real sometimes," he wrote, "like we've stepped into a place that wasn't meant for us." Pauline read those lines slowly, trying to imagine it, but she couldn't. Not fully. Coventry had always been full of people, of sound, of life. The idea of such vast emptiness was hard to grasp. But she kept reading. Henry began to write more about the men around him, not just their names or where they came from, but who they were becoming. The farmer who now moved with quiet confidence, the nervous clerk who had learned to stay calm under pressure, the young boy who no longer looked quite so young. War was changing them. It was changing him, too, though he never said that directly. There were moments in his letters where the rhythm broke, where a sentence would start one way and end another, as if something had interrupted the thought. He never described battle in full, not the noise, not the chaos, just pieces, enough to be understood, but not enough to be seen clearly. "Had a close one today," he wrote once. "Nothing to worry about." Pauline held on to that sentence longer than she should have, because it was the first time he had come close to saying it. The danger. From that point on, she began to read differently, not just what he wrote, but what he left out. The spaces between his words seemed to grow larger, filled with things she could only guess at. And still, he tried to keep parts of himself unchanged. He wrote about the sky at night, how clear it was, how the stars seemed closer than they ever had in England. He wrote about small routines, the things that made each day feel a little less uncertain. A cup of tea when it could be managed, a shared joke, a brief moment of quiet. "These are the things that keep you steady," he wrote. "You hold on to them." Pauline understood that. Back home, Coventry was no longer untouched. The war had found its way there, too. Air raid sirens had become part of daily life. Nights were broken by the distant hum of aircraft, by the tension of waiting for something that might or might not come. She wrote about it carefully, not to hide the truth, but to soften it, just as he did for her. "The sirens went off again last night, but everything is all right here. You don't need to worry." It was the same promise, sent back across the distance. For a time, their letters continued like this, two versions of reality meeting somewhere in the middle, his shaped by heat and uncertainty, hers by quiet waiting and resilience.
But the war didn't stand still. The fighting intensified. Movement became more frequent. Henry's letters grew less regular, sometimes arriving weeks apart. Each one felt more important than the last, as if it carried not just words, but proof that he was still there, still writing, still holding on. When they did come, they were different again. Shorter, more focused. He wrote less about where he was, more about what he felt, though even that came carefully, in measured lines. There are moments, he wrote once, when everything goes quiet, not outside, but here. He never explained further. He didn't need to. Pauline read that letter over and over, trying to understand what that silence meant. She began to notice something else, too. He was writing more about the past, about Coventry, about their walks, about small, ordinary moments that had once seemed unimportant. He described them in detail now, as if trying to fix them in place, to make sure they wouldn't fade. "I can still see it," he wrote, "the way the light looked in the evening, the sound of your footsteps next to mine." It was no longer just memory, it was something he held on to. And Pauline, reading those words, felt the distance between them sharply than ever before. Not just the miles, but the difference in what they were experiencing. She was still there, in the life they had known. He was somewhere else entirely. And yet, through those letters, they remained connected. One line at a time, one page at a time. But beneath it all, something was shifting. The optimism that once carried his words was quieter now, not gone, but changed, replaced by something steadier, more grounded, an understanding, perhaps, of what this war truly was. Not something distant, not something temporary, something that took and did not easily give back. In one of his letters, near the end of that long stretch in North Africa, he wrote a line that Pauline would never forget. "I don't think any of us come through this the same." It was the closest he had come to saying it outright, that the man who had left Coventry with a small bag and a simple promise was already becoming someone else. Pauline folded that letter carefully, placing it with the others. By now the stack had grown, a collection of days, of thoughts, of moments captured in ink. She didn't know how many more would come. She didn't know how far they would travel next, but she understood something now that she hadn't before. These letters were not just a way of staying connected. They were a record of change, of a life moving through something vast and unforgiving, trying to hold on to what mattered most. And the further Henry went, the more those words would have to carry.
When Henry's letters began arriving from Italy, Pauline noticed the change immediately. It wasn't just the place, though he described it differently from North Africa. There were mountains now, and rain and cold that settled deep into the bones. After the endless heat of the desert, this was something else entirely, something heavier. But the real difference was in his words. They had grown quieter. Not shorter, not empty, but more reflective, as if every sentence carried more weight than before. He no longer tried to make things sound lighter than they were. He didn't hide the difficulty, he simply accepted it. "The cold is worse than I expected," he wrote in one letter. "It stays with you even when you think you've warmed up. Everything feels slower here." He described the landscape carefully. Steep hills that made every step a struggle, mud that clung to boots and refused to let go, rain that turned the ground into something unstable, uncertain. Nothing like the open desert. Here, everything pressed in. And yet, there was a strange kind of beauty in it, too. "There are moments," he wrote, "when the fog lifts and you can see for miles. It's quiet then, almost peaceful. You forget for a second where you are." Pauline held on to those moments. because they felt like something she could recognize, small glimpses of calm in the middle of everything else. But those moments didn't last long. The fighting in Italy was different, slower, more drawn out, not the sudden bursts he had hinted at before, but a constant pressure, a sense that it could begin again at any time without warning. Henry didn't describe it directly, he never did, but the way he wrote made it clear. "There's a kind of waiting here," he said, "not the kind we knew before. This is different." Pauline understood that he was trying to explain something that couldn't easily be put into words, and still he wrote. He wrote about the men again, but now there were fewer names, fewer stories. Sometimes he mentioned someone once, and never again. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. She began to notice the gaps, the spaces where something had been left unsaid. And yet, as everything around him grew more uncertain, his letters to her became more certain than ever. He wrote about her differently now, not just as someone waiting at home, but as something constant, something that didn't change no matter where he was or what was happening. "I think about you more here than anywhere else," he wrote, "not just in the quiet moments, all the time." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't poetic in the way stories often try to be. It was simple, and because of that, it felt more real. Pauline could feel the distance between them more than ever, not just in miles, but in experience. The world Henry was living in now was something she could only imagine in fragments through the pieces he chose to share. At home, life continued, but it no longer resembled the life they had known before the war. Coventry had been bombed. Streets they had once walked together were no longer the same, buildings gone, familiar places reduced to something unrecognizable. She wrote about it, but carefully, just as he wrote about his world. "We're managing," she told him. "Things have changed, but people carry on." It was true, but incomplete, just like his letters. Winter settled in fully. Henry wrote about it often, the cold nights, the difficulty of sleeping, the way exhaustion built slowly over time. There was a weariness in his words now, not just physical, but something deeper. "I think you get used to it," he wrote once. "Not that it gets easier, just different." That word stayed with Pauline. Different. It seemed to define everything now. And yet, despite everything, there was still something in his letters that hadn't changed. He still noticed small things. The way light moved across the hills in the early morning, the sound of boots on wet ground, the brief silence that came just before everything began again. He held on to those details, because they were something solid in a world that often wasn't. As the months passed, the tone of his letters shifted again, not suddenly, but gradually. There was a sense of movement now, of something building. He didn't say where he might be sent next. He couldn't, but it was clear that Italy was not the end of the journey. "We'll be moving on at some point," he wrote. "Don't know when yet." Pauline read that line more than once. She had learned by now to understand what was written beneath the words. Change was coming, again. She wrote back as she always did, steady, detailed, filled with the small pieces of life that still remained. She told him about the things that hadn't changed, even as everything else had. She reminded him in every letter that there was still something waiting for him, that he was still part of it. His replies came when they could, sometimes delayed, sometimes shorter than before, but always there, until one letter arrived that felt different from all the others. There was no clear reason for it at first, the same handwriting, the same careful tone, but as she read, she felt it, a kind of stillness in his words. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he wrote, "about everything, about before, about after." He didn't finish that thought. Instead, he wrote about her again, about Coventry, about the life they had once imagined in such simple terms. "I hold on to that," he said, "more than anything."
Pauline folded the letter slowly, her hands lingering on the paper. By now the collection had grown large, dozens of letters, each one a piece of something bigger, a story unfolding across distance and time, written in fragments, carried across countries and continents. She didn't know where the next one would come from. She didn't know how much longer this would continue. But she felt it just as he did, that something was approaching. Not an end, not yet, but a turning point. The war was moving forward, and Henry was moving with it, further from the man who left Coventry, closer to something neither of them could fully see. And through it all, the letters remained, steady, fragile, carrying everything they could not say out loud.
The last letter arrived without warning. There was nothing about it, at first glance, that set it apart from the others. The same envelope, the same careful handwriting, the same journey across distance to reach her hands. But the date, written clearly at the top of the page, would come to mean everything. June 5th, 1944. Pauline didn't know it then, not as she unfolded the paper and began to read. To her, it was simply another letter, another piece of him sent home from somewhere she could not see. He didn't say where he was. By now he rarely did. The war had become something too large, too complex to describe in simple terms. But there was a feeling in his words, something steady and quiet, as if he had reached a place beyond uncertainty. "We're waiting again," he wrote. "Feels like everything has been leading up to this." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. There was a calmness in the letter that Pauline hadn't felt before. Not the lightness of earlier days, not the strain of Italy, but something else, something resolved. He wrote about small things, as he always had, the sky, the sound of the sea in the distance, the way time seemed to slow down when there was nothing to do but wait. But even those details felt different now, as if he was noticing them more carefully, holding on to them in a way he hadn't before. "I've been thinking about home a lot," he wrote. "Not just the place, everything about it." Pauline paused there, her fingers resting lightly against the page, because she understood what he meant. He wrote about Coventry, not as it was now, but as it had been. The streets they had walked, the quiet evenings, the life that had once felt so certain. He described it with a clarity that felt almost like he was standing there again, seeing it not as memory, but as something real. And then he wrote about her. Not in long, elaborate sentences, not in anything that felt forced or dramatic, just simple, certain words. "You've been with me through all of this," he said, "every step in one way or another." Pauline read that line more than once, because it was true in the only way it could be. Through every place he had gone, the deserts, the mountains, the endless distance, her presence had been carried in letters, in thoughts, in the quiet moments he had tried to describe. It was the one thing that had not changed. The letter was not long, but it didn't feel unfinished. At the end, he wrote the same words he had written so many times before. "I'll write again when I can." There was no reason to think otherwise. Pauline folded the letter carefully, just as she had done with all the others. By now, the tin box was nearly full, a collection of pages that held years of a life lived apart, but never truly disconnected. She placed it inside, alongside the rest, unaware that this one would be the last. Days passed, then weeks. At first, the silence felt familiar. There had been gaps before, delays, interruptions, the unpredictable nature of war. Pauline told herself it was the same now, that another letter would come just as it always had. But this silence stretched longer and heavier. By mid-June, news began to spread, not through letters, but through the radio, through newspapers, through voices that carried urgency and disbelief. The invasion had begun. France, Normandy. Names that once felt distant were now everywhere, spoken with a mixture of hope
and fear. It was the turning point everyone had been waiting for, the moment that might change the course of everything. Pauline listened, as everyone did, and with each passing day, the weight of waiting grew. Because she knew. Even without knowing exactly where Henry was, she understood that he would be there, somewhere within it, somewhere in the vast movement of men and machines and uncertainty. And so she waited, not just for news, for a letter. But none came. Time moved differently after that. Each day felt longer than it should have, marked not by routine, but by absence. The space where his words should have been grew more noticeable, more impossible to ignore. Then, one morning, there was a knock at the door. It was not unexpected, not really, but that didn't make it easier. Two men stood there, their expressions careful, measured. They didn't need to say much. The meaning was already there, in the way they held themselves, in the silence before the words. Pauline listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, because some part of her had already understood. Henry had been killed. The details were few. A place, a date, 6 weeks after the letter she now held in her hands, 6 weeks between words written in quiet reflection and the end of everything that followed. He was 26 years old. The men left. The door closed, and the world, for a moment, became still. There was no dramatic collapse, no immediate breaking, just a quiet, overwhelming absence, the kind that arrives not at once, but settles slowly, filling every space. Pauline walked back inside. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. She went to the tin box, opened it, and for the first time she looked at the letters not as something ongoing, but as something complete. 112 letters, each one a moment, a voice, a piece of a life that had continued even when he was far away. She took out the last one, June 5th, 1944. Read it again, and this time the words felt different. Not because they had changed, but because she had. I'll write again when I can. He never did. But the words he had already sent remained. They filled the silence he had left behind, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to hold on to, enough to remember not just how his story ended, but how it was lived. Years would pass. The war would end. The world would rebuild itself, slowly, unevenly. But the letters stayed, carefully kept, preserved not as relics, but as something alive, a record of love that had endured distance, uncertainty, and fear, a connection that had not been broken, even by the finality of war. People would speak of battles, of victories, of strategies and turning points. But in that small tin box was something else, a different kind of history, one written not in maps and movements, but in words between two people who had held on to each other across impossible distance. Henry never came home, but his voice did.